So we'll start with the respiratory system, and this system, what I want you to focus on are the parts of the respiratory system. It's separated into upper and lower, so think about the function of each part. What's the mechanism for breathing, and we call breathing expiration and inspiration. How is breathing controlled by the nervous system and through chemicals, and where and how is gas exchange accomplished? Here we see an overview of the respiratory system. We break it down into upper and lower, and I will talk about both separately. You want to know the pathway that air takes through the respiratory system. So when air enters our body, we typically breathe through the nose. Some people do breathe through the mouth, especially if they have some kind of blockage in the nose. But typically we breathe through the nose, and that helps us filter and humidify the air a little bit more than if we breathe through the mouth. From the nose, air goes to the pharynx, and remember that's the throat, to the larynx, which is where your voice box is located, down to the trachea, which splits into the bronchi, that goes into each individual lung. Each bronchi is going to split into smaller and smaller tubes called bronchus, and then finally those tubes terminate in the alveoli. That's the place where gas exchange occurs. The upper respiratory tract functions to filter, warm, and humidify the air. So the air's final destination in the lungs is your alveoli, and that's a very thin, very delicate, one cell thick structure. If that structure gets too cold or dehydrated, those cells will die. So they'll lose their moisture through diffusion, and those cells will shrivel and die. You have to make sure that air is humidified and warmed before it gets to those very delicate alveoli. The nose is the first area where the air passes through, and the nose is seen here. Air enters through that nasal orifice and then enters that nasal cavity. In the nasal cavity, you have these grooves. Those are called nasal concha, and those nasal concha are coated in epithelium that produces mucus. Mucus functions in trapping pathogens that enter the body. Those nasal concha also have cilia on the terminal end of the epithelial cells, and those cilia are finger-like projections that also help trap pathogens because they're coated in mucus. In the nasal cavity, there's a ton of blood vessels, and if you remember, blood carries your body's heat, so that huge number of blood vessels is going to help heat up that air that enters the nasal cavity. From the nasal cavity, air enters the pharynx. I mentioned in the last lecture, there's three parts of the pharynx. The nasopharynx is here behind the nose. The oropharynx is here behind the mouth. And then the laryngopharynx is located just posterior to the epiglottis. The summary of the nose has the openings that allows air to enter the nasal cavities. Those nasal cavities are covered by hair and mucus that helps filter the air and trap pathogens. The nasal cavity, again, has a lot of capillaries. In the capillaries, we have blood flow, and that blood flow is going to heat the air. We also have specialized odor cells that are located in the nose. So the reason that you can smell things is because you have nerve endings that are sensitive to certain chemicals. And those chemicals can bind to the cells in the nose and send an electrical message to the brain that we interpret in the olfactory center. And that's how we get our sense of smell. We'll talk about sense of smell when we talk about the nervous system in, I think, 2 weeks, or not 2 weeks, but at the beginning of, not next week, but the following. In your nose, we also have connections to the tear glands. So if you were to cry or if your eyes were watering, you might notice that your nose is runny. The reason for that is because you have those tear ducts emptying into the nose. From that nose, if you ever have tear ducts or anything from your eyes entering into the nose, that does dump into the pharynx. So has anyone ever put eye drops in their eyes and then noticed that they could taste it? It's a very weird sensation, but the reason for that is because you put the eye drops in your eyes, the eye drops will go into your nose, and then they drip down into the back of your mouth and the pharynx. You have taste buds located in the back of your mouth and pharynx, so that's why you can taste the eye drops you put into your eyes. The pharynx is your throat. So the pharynx has a couple functions. It's going to trigger the swallowing reflex that allows you to swallow when you're eating food. It's also going to transfer air down to your trachea, and it's just a a small passageway that connects the mouth and the nose to the larynx. It has those three portions that I pointed out: the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. In your pharynx, you also have the tonsils. Remember, your tonsils are lymphatic tissue that contains lymphocytes and other white blood cells, and that's going to help fight any pathogens that you might trap in the mucus that's located in the nasal cavity or in the oral cavity. So that's, again, going to function in immunity and protection. The larynx is your voice box. So it's a triangular cartilaginous structure that passes between the pharynx and the trachea. The reason that we can speak is because air passes from our lungs to our mouth or from our mouth to our lungs. And as it does that, it will vibrate the vocal cords, and the vocal cords produce the sound that comes out of our mouth. So those vocal cords are in the voice box, and they're located in the larynx. So here's a picture of the larynx. The larynx contains those vocal folds or those vocal cords. Air is going to pass from the mouth into the trachea, and as that air passes from the mouth into the trachea, these cords will vibrate. The shape of our mouth or the way that our tongue moves will control what that sound sounds like, essentially.
So if you're sick and you hear a voice, is that because it's just swollen?
It's usually because these are so swollen that they can't move and vibrate correctly. Yeah, the other thing is, if you ever think somebody's choking, to ask them to speak. If they can't speak, that's because their airway is blocked and they can't vibrate those vocal cords. So that's the upper respiratory tract. What we want to know about the upper respiratory tract is it functions in bringing air to the lower respiratory tract. It moistens and humidifies the air so it doesn't damage any of the delicate tissue in the lower respiratory tract. The lower respiratory tract is the trachea, the bronchial tree, and the lungs. The important part of the lungs is the alveoli because that's where the gas exchange occurs. The trachea is actually pretty boring because it's just a tube that transfers air into the bronchi. There are some interesting things about the trachea. So if you look here, you can see the trachea is covered, or it's made up of large cartilaginous rings. So that's to prevent your trachea from accidentally falling or collapsing into itself. Your esophagus is made up of entirely smooth muscle. It doesn't have a lot of structural components, but food is not as important to your body as air is. So we do have those rings around our trachea to hold that trachea open at all time. Has anyone ever heard of a tracheostomy? That's where if you can't breathe, if you have maybe some swelling in the upper part of your trachea, they can puncture your trachea and allow air to enter your lungs. You don't need your mouth to breathe. The power or the force for breathing actually comes down from below your lungs and your diaphragm. So as long as you have an opening into the trachea below that inflammation, you're able to get air in. When they do a tracheostomy, it has to be in between those cartilaginous rings because they are so tough and rigid. The trachea is it's lined with mucus that helps keep the lungs clean. So just like with the nose and other parts of your body, we want to make sure that pathogens can't get into our very important organs. Your trachea has cells that line it that are pseudostratified columnar epithelium. This epithelium specializes in secreting mucus, and mucus is secreted on the apical end, which is the end that's near the center of the trachea. As that mucus is secreted, it's going to coat the entire lining of the trachea. And that makes it more likely that any pathogens that enter your body are going to be trapped in the mucus. The other thing it traps is dust particles. So if you ever think of air pollution or being outside and maybe you're on a dirt road and you could see all that dirt in the air suspended, if that gets into your lungs, it can harm and damage your lungs. So we have mucus that coats our entire respiratory tract to trap that damaging dust or debris or whatever is trying to get into your body. We call this apical area the mucociliary elevator. What that means is you have mucus that coats the trachea and then little cilia, which are these projections that can beat and move that mucus upwards. So in order to get mucus out of your trachea and prevent it from accumulating in your lungs or accumulating in your trachea and blocking it, these cilia actually have little muscles inside of them that beat and move that mucus upwards. So they push it up and out of your trachea into your mouth. From your mouth, you can either spit that mucus out or swallow it. And if there's any pathogens, they would be destroyed by stomach acid. From the trachea, it splits into the bronchial trees. As you move into smaller and smaller tubes in the body, the diameter gets smaller and the surface area gets larger. So we're also going to be concerned with surface area as we start splitting these bronchial trees into smaller bronchi and bronchioles. The reason that we have those splitting is to increase the surface area, and at the terminal end of each bronchiole, you have an alveoli. The alveoli is where gas exchange occurs. And gas exchange occurs by diffusion. We need a lot of oxygen in our body, so the larger the surface area, the more oxygen we can bring in effectively, and the more carbon dioxide we can get rid of from our body. The place where we exchange gases is alveoli. That's a one-cell thick structure that really promotes diffusion because it's made up of a simple squamous epithelium cell that's a very thin, flat cell. And we'll look at a picture of that in a minute. The lungs contain secondary bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. Alveoli are the most important part of your lungs because that is where the gas exchange occurs. The lungs have lobes to them. The right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung has 2 lobes. Your heart's located more on the left side of your body, meaning you have less room for lungs on the left side, so you have less lobes on the left. Each lobe is divided into lobules, and then the lungs are enclosed in a membrane called pleura. Pleura is a double membrane system that lines your lungs. And the reason you have this is because your lungs move. Anytime you have movement, you can have friction, and anytime you have friction, you can damage tissue. So lining the thoracic cavity, you have what's called a parietal pleura or an outside pleura, and then lining the top of the lung, you have a visceral pleura. Organs are sometimes called viscera, so that membrane sits on top of the lung itself. And in between both of those membranes, you have what's called serous fluid. That's just a lubricating fluid that helps protect the tissue so you don't get any frictional damage as you breathe. In your lungs, you have about 300 million alveoli, and this gives you a huge surface area. So the surface area in your lungs, believe it or not, is about the size of a tennis court. And that's really, really good for you because that large surface area means you have a huge amount of gas diffusion. Your lungs are never going to be the limiting area for oxygen coming into the body unless you have some kind of disease or sickness. Inside the lungs, you have those alveoli where you transport gases. Surrounding the alveoli are the capillaries, because once you get those gases into your body, you want to carry them or carry those gases and deliver it to the rest of your body, and you do that through the blood. The alveoli and capillaries are one layer of epithelium, and they allow exchange of gases very efficiently. And then the alveoli are aligned with surfactant. That helps keep those alveoli open. These are very thin, open air sacs. And the natural response when you have an open, thin sac that doesn't have some kind of structural holding it open is to close. So when we have surfactant on the outside of those alveoli, it helps break surface tension of water on the outside, and it keeps those alveoli open. And the best way to think of it is like a balloon. So if I blew up a balloon and I let go of it, the air would leave, right? And that's because you have atmospheric pressure pushing on the balloon and pushing the air out. Alveoli in the lungs, they don't deflate, even though they don't have anything structurally to hold them open. And that's because surfactant removes that pressure from the water that's around it. Here we can see the picture of our alveoli. So I mentioned before, alveoli are open sacs. This would be a bronchiole. That's a smaller bronchi that approaches this terminal end of the bronchiole. At the terminal end of the bronchiole, you have the alveolar sacs. And you can see just how thin these alveolar sacs are. They're 1 cell thick. And because it's so thin, we're able to very quickly and efficiently move oxygen into the capillaries and carbon dioxide out. The capillaries on the outside surround the entire alveoli, and they pick up oxygen and then deposit carbon dioxide so you can exhale that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. What you'll notice is the pulmonary artery will come from the right ventricle, and then go down into these capillary beds around the alveoli. That's where we pick up oxygen when the blood leaves the right side of the heart. After you pick up that oxygen, you have pulmonary venules that go back to the left atrium, and then that blood is pumped to the rest of the body to deliver oxygen. The next thing we talk about is the physical process of breathing. Breathing we call ventilation, and we separate breathing into two parts. We have inhalation or inspiration and exhalation or expiration. Inhalation is active, meaning we have to work to inhale, and that brings air into our body. Exhalation is typically passive, meaning we don't have to expend any energy to exhale, and that brings air out of our body. I moved this slide around a little bit, so it's a couple slides later in that printout that I gave you, but I think it makes more sense to be here. And this talks about the pressure-volume relationship. So the way that air moves into and out of our lungs is by bulk flow. And bulk flow is similar to diffusion. We're going to move from an area of higher pressure, from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. So that pressure gradient is what drives air movement. The way that we change pressure in our lungs to create that gradient is through changing the volume. So when you inhale, when you take a deep breath in, you might notice that your thoracic cavity gets a lot bigger. So take a deep breath in, and you'll notice that your rib cage moves up and out, and your whole chest gets a little bit bigger. If you were wearing something tight, you would feel that material kind of stretch over your skin. So what you do when you inhale is you increase the size of your thoracic cavity. When the size of the thoracic cavity increases, that drops the pressure of the contents of the thoracic cavity. So by increasing the size of your chest, you put less pressure on the air molecules inside, and the pressure decreases. And when you have a decrease in pressure, the pressure in your lungs is lower than that of the atmosphere, and air moves by bulk flow from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. So here we see in this top picture, we have a container shown with this dotted line. And when that container is pulled outwards, the size of it increases. That puts less pressure on the air inside. So that would drop the pressure inside, and then air would move in by bulk flow. This example down here would be the opposite. This would show exhalation. So if you put pressure on a container, then when you put pressure on it, you put pressure on what's on the inside, and it will expel air out. And the easiest way to think of this, I think, is with a syringe. So if you had a syringe and you pull the plunger back, you increase the size of that plunger. And what that does, or you increase the size of that syringe opening. And what that does is it puts less pressure inside the syringe, so it draws in anything that's outside. And then you have the opposite. When you push something out of a syringe, you push the plunger down. That decreases the volume inside the syringe. It increases pressure, and it pushes things out. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, good. So that's what inspiration is based on. In inspiration, we have contraction of our diaphragm and our intercostal muscles. The intercostal muscles are the muscles in between our ribs, and when they contract, they shorten, and they do that to pull the rib cage up. The diaphragm is a muscle that's naturally curved up like this, and it pushes up into your lungs. So when we inspire air, we contract that diaphragm, and that actually flattens it out. And by flattening it out, it pulls the lungs down and increases the size of the lungs. When it does that, that decreases the pressure in the lungs, and it will draw air into the lungs. So that's inspiration. And because we have to contract that muscle, we say that it's an active process because we're actively contracting the diaphragm in order for inspiration to occur. Sometimes I think it's easier to understand what I'm explaining if you have a picture. So here we see the diaphragm, and this muscle is curved up and it pushes into the lungs. And these are the muscles that are in between the ribs. These are called the internal and external intercostals. These are internal, these are external. When these muscles contract, the rib cage moves up and out, and you can feel that happening when you inhale. You can feel your rib cage move. The diaphragm contracts and moves down. When this happens, the whole thoracic cavity becomes larger, A larger thoracic cavity means lower pressure, and air is drawn into that lower pressure area. So sometimes I always tell people to think about lower pressure as a vacuum. The reason a vacuum works in your house is because you have a pump that creates lower pressure inside of it. Expiration is the opposite. Expiration is passive. So after you inhale, exhalation happens passively by simply relaxing the diaphragm. So you don't have to contract any muscles in order to expire air. You just relax that diaphragm, which is why we say it's passive. When you relax your intercostal muscles and you relax your diaphragm muscle, your thoracic cavity is going to fall, decreasing the size of it. That puts pressure on the gas inside, and then you exhale that air. Here we see the picture of what's happening. So the rib cage then falls back down. The diaphragm moves back up. That makes the size of the thoracic cavity smaller. That pushes the air out of the lungs. You have different volumes of air when you breathe. A normal breathing volume is called tidal volume. So that's the volume that you have as you're sitting there quietly. That's normal inspiratory and expiratory volume. We have other volumes such as vital capacity. Vital capacity could tell us about your overall health of your lungs, and that's the total amount of air that you can move into and out of your lungs in one breath. A lot of times doctors will measure vital capacity to see about the elasticity or fibrous conditions of your lungs, which we're not going to talk about the pathophysiology of the lungs, but it is an important concept medically. Inspiratory and expiratory reserve volume is the volume of air that you can inhale or exhale greater than that tidal volume. So if you were going to jump into a swimming pool and you took a huge breath beforehand, you would be using your inspiratory reserve volume. You're just inhaling more than you normally do at rest. Expiratory reserve volume would be if you exhale more than at rest. And then the last volume we have is residual volume. The residual volume is the air that always stays in your lungs. And you always need to have air in your lungs because if you didn't, your lung would collapse. That's a condition that takes a lot of medical effort to reverse. It's not going to heal naturally. So you want to always have air in your lungs. Once you lose air in your lungs, your lung collapses, and that's a trip to the ER. This visually shows vital capacity and then other capacities. So if this was showing the total amount of air that you can have in your lungs, tidal volume is a small amount. So really at rest, we only use a small amount or a small, fraction of the capability of our lungs because we're only moving a little bit in and out. If we needed extra air or extra oxygen, we would be using our inspiratory capacity and doing a deep inhale. If we had to breathe out, we would be using our expiratory capacity and doing a deep exhale. Notice that we never go into this residual volume. That's the volume of air that always stays in your lungs to keep it inflated. Our breathing is controlled by the nervous system. In our brainstem, we have a respiratory control center, and that respiratory control center is going to send nerve impulses to our diaphragm muscle. So by controlling the contraction of our diaphragm muscle, we control our breathing rate. And we have different mechanisms to match our breathing rate to our activity level, and that's through chemoreceptors in our body. This shows the respiratory center. So this is our brainstem. The brainstem is where you find the control centers for most of your vital functions. Your cardiac control center or your vomiting reflex or your respiratory control center or some of your digestive reflexes are controlled in the brainstem. And that brainstem is going to take information about your respiratory needs from chemoreceptors in the body, and then it sends its messages out through nerves. Those messages go and innervate the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm, and they cause those muscles to contract either more frequently or less frequently, or with a stronger contraction or a weaker contraction in order to control respiratory rate and depth. I mentioned before that chemoreceptors help our respiratory control center control our respiratory rate and depth, and they do that by detecting the amount of carbon dioxide that we have in our blood. So most people think that our body would detect oxygen levels in our blood, but we actually don't detect oxygen levels because it's so critical for oxygen levels to stay elevated or high enough for us to survive. So what we usually detect is carbon dioxide levels. And carbon dioxide levels fluctuate a little bit more than oxygen. It's not as regulated. So our body will detect carbon dioxide levels in our blood, and if it detects elevated carbon dioxide, then it's going to increase the respiratory rate, and by doing so, we would expel more carbon dioxide and bring in more oxygen. The other thing that chemoreceptors detect is pH. pH is either being acidic or alkaline. If our body becomes acidic, then we're going to increase ventilation as well, because carbon dioxide is actually an acidic molecule. The way that we carry carbon dioxide in our blood is as bicarbonate, and bicarbonate is acidic. So it's a buffer, it's an acidic molecule, and that bicarbonate is going to make our pH more acidic. When it's more acidic, we're going to increase ventilation to get rid of carbon dioxide from our lungs, and that's going to bring us back into acid-base balance. So we have chemoreceptors that are in our periphery or in our entire body. We also have chemoreceptors located in our brain because it's extremely critical to bring oxygen to your brain at all times. If anyone's ever gone without oxygen to their brain for more than 5 minutes, usually their brain starts degenerating, and it can lead to brain damage very quickly. So it's very important to have oxygen to the brain. Here we look at exchange of gases in the body. I did add to this slide a little bit because I think it helps make it a little bit more clear what we're talking about when we talk about that exchange. So in order to exchange gases in the body, we first have exchange in the lungs. In the lungs, we move oxygen into our body by taking oxygen from the atmosphere, bringing it into the alveoli, and then transferring it to the capillaries. The capillaries from our lungs then go back to the heart, and then blood from the heart is pumped to the rest of the body to deliver that oxygen. Also in the lungs, we get rid of our carbon dioxide. So remember, blood from the right side of the body that contains very little oxygen and a lot of carbon dioxide goes to the lungs. And in the lungs, that blood is going to leave the capillaries and enter the alveoli, and then we can exhale that air. So that's the external respiration, where we bring oxygen into the body from the atmosphere and move it from alveoli to capillaries. The carbon dioxide from our body there is moved out into the alveoli, and we exhale it. The way that gases move, I mentioned they move by bulk flow, and bulk flow is like diffusion. You move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. And with gases, we base that on what's called partial pressure. What that means is that the pressure of each individual gas is separate from the rest. So we're not talking about the pressure of all the gases, we're talking about pressure of oxygen only or carbon dioxide only. That's how we're able to move oxygen into the body in the lungs and carbon dioxide out of the body in the lungs. It's because that gradient is based on the pressure of those gases alone. Oxygen is carried through the blood bound to hemoglobin. Remember, hemoglobin is that iron-based molecule found in red blood cells, and it's able to bind for oxygen and carry it throughout the body. Carbon dioxide does not bind to hemoglobin as effectively as oxygen does, so it partially dissolves in the blood to be carried, but most of it's converted to bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is an ion that's very, very soluble in blood. So that bicarbonate ion is carried in the blood, and then once you get to the lungs, bicarbonate is converted back into carbon dioxide, and you can exhale that bicarbonate. External respiration, as I mentioned before, that's the respiration that occurs in the lungs and the alveoli. In the alveoli, you have movement of oxygen from the alveoli into the capillary beds. You do that because the partial pressure of oxygen is higher in the alveoli than in the capillaries. You have movement of carbon dioxide from the capillaries into the alveoli where it's exhaled. Carbon dioxide arrives in the capillaries from the right side of the heart as bicarbonate. Before it could be exhaled, it has to be converted back to carbon dioxide, and it uses an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. That carbonic anhydrase converts bicarbonate to carbon dioxide, and then carbon dioxide will diffuse through the capillaries into the alveoli, and you can exhale it. Our internal respiration is where we exchange gases at the tissue. So at the tissue, we have a very high amount of carbon dioxide. In the process of making ATP and energy, carbon dioxide is produced as a byproduct. Carbon dioxide, as I mentioned before, is inherently acidic, and we want to get that out of our body as soon as possible because an acidic pH in our body can denature enzymes. So at our tissue, high amounts of carbon dioxide are produced. That carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of the tissue and into the blood. And the way that we carry carbon dioxide from our blood and tissue to the outside of the body is as bicarbonate. So at the tissue, carbon dioxide is converted to bicarbonate. Then bicarbonate is soluble in the blood, so the blood will carry bicarbonate to the lungs. And then at the lungs, bicarbonate is converted to carbon dioxide and it's exhaled. Oxygen in external respiration moves from our blood because the oxygen level in the tissue is so low. Hemoglobin will release oxygen and oxygen diffuses into our tissue. And then in the tissue, we use oxygen to produce ATP, which is the energy source of the cells. Here we see the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the body. So this is just like I described before. This shows the lungs. This is external respiration. Here we see oxygen goes from that alveoli into the red blood cell. It binds to hemoglobin in the red blood cell, and it's carried throughout the body and delivered to the tissue where it's used. In the lungs, we have bicarbonate. That bicarbonate is carried in the plasma. Bicarbonate will turn into carbon dioxide and then go into the alveoli where it's exhaled. And then the opposite happens at the tissue. At the tissue, we have a lot of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide will diffuse from the tissue into the plasma and be converted to bicarbonate. Will, in the tissue, release oxygen from our red blood cells, and it will diffuse into the tissue to be used. Does anyone have any questions? Was that confusing? Yeah. If it is, watch the video. I'll post the video online. Sometimes